Welcome to this webinar on what's happening in Myanmar from putsch to popular protest. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. Our session is jointly hosted today with the Center for Global Women's Studies and the School of Political Science and Sociology at NUI Galway. I'm so grateful to our speaker to being here today and talking about her experience and observations. She's going to be introduced by Dr. Nidadavolu, who's chairing. Nata is Senior Lecturer in Sociology and Director of the Center for Global Women's Studies at NUI Galway. Nata, over to you. Nata, do we have you? You can kick us off. There we are.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And I would also like to add my welcome to everyone attending this webinar. And on behalf of the Center for Global Women's Studies, as well as the School of Political Science and Sociology. It's my deep personal pleasure to introduce Vijaya Nidadavolu, who is a longtime colleague. Vijaya is a development specialist with a 20+ year career in querying the impact of gender inequality on people, institutions, and societies. She combines a theoretical and conceptual understanding of gender justice with a strong set of skills using communications and advocacy for change. Her work on social development and inclusion issues has been grounded in developing country and conflict-affected contexts in South and Southeast Asia. She's experienced in implementing and coordinating gender equality, justice, and women's rights programming, research, campaigning, and advocacy. She held roles with the International Center for Research on Women, where we work together, and the Population Council Asia Regional Office early in her career, and most recently led the strategic engagement portfolio for an impactful justice program in Myanmar called My Justice, where she combined the forces of popular and alternative media to drive a campaign that reached millions. As an experienced freelance gender specialist, she has provided consultancy services to feminist networks, organizations, INGOs, NGOs, and UN agencies. This has included delivering formative research, undertaking stakeholder and policy analysis, testing and implementing culturally appropriate interventions, leveraging evidence for policy advocacy, and using strategic communications innovations for change. She is an associate with Gender at Work, an international feminist network providing advice to research and program initiatives. She holds a master's in mass communications from Central University of Hyderabad and a master's in gender and development studies from the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex. Welcome, Vijaya, and over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Nata, for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be invited by the Moore Institute and the Center for Global Women's Studies at the National University of Ireland for this talk. It does feel like a moment of epiphany because I've lived and worked in Myanmar for many years, for almost 6 years. So what I'm about to share with you is deeply personal. I've made an attempt to make it primarily pictorial and tell it in the form of a story. If you have questions while I'm talking, we'll be grateful if you pop them into the question and answer box that we have open. And David, who is here with us on the call, will moderate that and we'll make sure we respond to your questions at the end of the talk. So without much ado, I'm going to move to my presentation. So please give me a minute while I set it up. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the story of what's happened in Myanmar, and I've titled this with the hashtag that has been trending for many months since the beginning of the coup, which is all over social media on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter primarily. The story I'm going to focus on is going to be what's happening on the streets and in the digital mediums. And as you know, there's a spring revolution that is happening in many parts of Southeast Asia, and Myanmar is the latest entrant to this club. So before I get into what's happening in the protest, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a historical background. So as you know, on the very early hours of the 1st of February, the junta chief, Aung Hlaing, he seized power from Myanmar's democratically elected government. And the claim was that the elections held last year in November were marred by fraud. On the 1st of February at 3 a.m. in the morning, Win Mint, the president, and the state councillor, Aung San Suu Kyi, who were both leaders of the National League for Democracy, the ruling party, they were detained, and they continue to be in detention to date. So this came on the heels of months of negotiation after the military-backed USDP party lost the elections very badly. The NLD secured a landslide victory. As you probably know, there's a bicameral parliament in Myanmar, and constitutionally 25% of the seats are actually held by the military. So it's the other 75% which are contestable seats. So of which the USDP only managed to secure 33 seats and the rest went to the NLD. So it was a huge sweep, better than even the performance in the 2015 elections. So analysts say that this is inevitable because the reform agenda that the NLD pursued over the last 5 years was coming too close to the military's own hold over power. So even though the military has never really gone away from mainstream politics and their stranglehold on power has never really been relaxed, there were enough moves being made by the NLD that threatened the military's stranglehold over the economy particularly, as well as political power. The final factor to consider here is the commander-in-chief of the Myanmar army. He's close to retirement and he was eyeing the role of the presidency. But communication between him and the lady, Aung San Suu Kyi, had broken down so badly that I believe they were not even able to face each other in a room. So it is thought widely that this particular coup was a move to really teach her a lesson. The scepter of military control over Myanmar has never quite gone away. Even during previous elections, there has always been the fear that the military would seize power if things didn't go their way. So the quote I have included here is from many years ago, before the 2015 elections, when the senior general said, "Oh, we are not going to carry out a coup." Similarly, high-ranking officials made similar statements both during and after the 2020 elections. So the shadow of the military never quite goes away or never quite went away in Myanmar. So what did it look like in the interim years? So there were several years of dictatorship, as you know, in Myanmar, right from 1960, several decades of it, during which time Suu Kyi was a major character and player, getting widespread international recognition for being a democracy icon. In 2015, after the military started a series of reforms to what they considered a disciplined, flourishing pathway to democracy, which they initiated in 2010, and a slow opening up of Myanmar, both the economy as well as the social and digital spheres. In 2015, the elections were held, but she was not allowed to become president because constitutionally anyone with a child of foreign origin was not allowed to become president. And this was particularly targeted at her. The 2008 constitution also granted the military complete control over 3 key ministries: the defense, the home affairs, and border affairs, and gave them broad powers to declare a state of emergency at any point. So in effect, this was just a transition in name only, where the real control over key ministries and the economy, as well as the real power center, continued to be the military. But this was also a time, the 5 years, when you saw a revolution of sorts, especially in the digital domain. Where earlier a SIM card cost more than $1,000, they were now available for $1. So this opened up the World Wide Web to the young in Myanmar, and suddenly this country was connected. There are figures to show that there are more SIM cards than people in Myanmar. This was a time during which exiled activists, people who had been exiled, who had left the country, who had run away during various uprisings, right from the 1988 uprising to the one in 2007, who had gone off to nearby neighboring countries, were all beginning to trickle back in, because as things were opening up, civil society also began to mark a space for itself. But when Daw San Suu Kyi took over in 2015, over a couple of years, it became quite clear that she was cut from the same cloth as the military, and she wasn't really going to allow a true loosening of strings. So civil society also began to realize that they were not going to enjoy the kind of freedoms that they thought they would. So the shadow of the dictatorship very much existed during these years. And this is a time in which several international organizations, embassies, and others started to trickle into Myanmar as well, and started to engage with the government of Myanmar. It was, however, a period of policy paralysis, because it's a deeply hierarchical society where people are used to deferring to the superior. Getting anything done was very, very difficult. For internationals, people like me who were working in the community, engaging with the government was difficult, because everything took building trust. And for a society that was emerging after years of dictatorship, getting trust or winning trust and being able to open up conversation was very difficult. So there's an aura of mistrust both between the people of Myanmar, the different ethnicities that make up the very diverse community there, as well as a deep mistrust of outsiders and internationals. This is, of course, also a period during which several conflicts in ethnic areas continued, whether it was with the Karen, the Kachin, the Mon, the Shan, the Rakhine, the Wa, and the Chin. Efforts at establishing peace and establishing a cessation of armed struggle, which was something that was undertaken by Aung San Suu Kyi's father straight after the Burmese independence in 1947, when he tried to unify the country and bring all the warring ethnicities into some sort of union. Also called the Panglong Conference, was something that became a mere shadow. So while the original purpose was to try and create unity, again, here Aung San Suu Kyi showed very little appetite to really bring the diverse people of Myanmar together. Internationally, her reputation, as well as how Myanmar was perceived globally, changed drastically after the genocide of 2017, when the Rohingya were driven out in the thousands across the border to Bangladesh. The public reacted to this with a massive sympathy wave in favor of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi. Posters saying, "We stand with you, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi," where she was featured along with prominent generals, occupied public spaces, not just in mainland Burma-dominated cities like Mandalay and Yangon, but also in ethnic areas like in Karen State and Shan State. You couldn't escape these posters. So where she was this kind of only symbol of challenge to the military dictatorship, public opinion and the way in which it was expressed in favor of Burmese unity was very much around her image and iconography. So here's a society, like I said, that has been deeply traumatized, that is very fractured, where several conflicts continued to exist, and where hierarchies continued to exist, and polarization and hate speech against the Muslims and the Rohingya in particular was very high. So this is the context in which the elections took place in 2020 and the subsequent coup happened under the circumstances that I've just described. So what happened as soon as the coup happened? People reacted with shock, because what they feared in those interim years, right from 2010 to 2020, suddenly came true. Because in all those years, even though people were aware that there was no effort to unify this diverse community, that she wasn't really a voice for the marginalized, they held on to the hope that she was the only thing that could unify Burma and that could bring people democracy in the country. And at all costs, she had to be protected, and the NLD's moves had to be protected. And suddenly that was gone. The military was back in control. So people, again, were facing a possibility of going back to the deep, dark days of the past, where they lived under constant fear, where they had no access to information, they had no access to the World Wide Web, and that their children would face what they had faced as young people. I heard these lines from friends and colleagues, people in their 40s saying, I don't want this for my children. People in their 20s saying, I've tasted freedom. I don't want to go back to the dark ages. So everyone reacted with shock and then anger. And that is what propelled people onto the streets. So what you saw was a very deep uprising, which came from a very, from literally the stomach of the people of Myanmar. And what was interesting to notice was this protest had two dimensions. There was the protest on the street, and there was a protest on the digital domain. So on the street, in the interim years, the labor movements and the student movements had been coalescing, had been organizing in the background. So those kind of unions immediately kicked off and got organizing and started to bring people out onto the streets. Digitally, at this time, the young of Myanmar who had access to, what was happening in Hong Kong and in Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia where there were revolutions taking off, they had access to the tools and techniques that other people were using in those countries. So you saw an outpouring of expression both on public as well as digital domains. And the kind of crowds that I think took observers by surprise, whether it was the military or whether it was analysts or whether it was those of us who were living within the country, because we did not expect this. One of the main parts of the protest was the civil disobedience movement, which is people who worked within the government system. Of course, the interim, the government that was headed by the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi, who had also tasted certain freedoms and were able to engage and enjoyed some of the fruits of their own labor, suddenly realizing that they were going to lose those freedoms. So whether it was lawyers, doctors, engineers, bank employers, railway workers, and in many instances, people from the police force, people started to participate in the civil disobedience movement. They refused to go to work. One of the main things that came out and was very obvious to many of us observing events within Myanmar was that women were very much at the forefront of organizing and bringing people out onto the streets. So Ethin Zarmang, who is in the picture here to your left with her raising the three-finger salute, is someone who had stood for elections in the 2020 elections and won her seat, but also had faced a lot of public ire because she had prominently stood with the Rohingya. And she had faced a lot of trolling for that, but she was one of the main organizers bringing students and women out onto the streets. The other figure here on your right is Mamo Sandra Mint, who was the head of the Federation of General Workers of Myanmar. The workers of Myanmar had been protesting right from when COVID-related measures were severely impacting the workers and government sector workers particularly. So she was behind those women coming out onto the streets. You had people of all hues, colors, nationalities, ethnicities coming out onto the streets of Myanmar. And I use the word nationalities here very intentionally, because within Myanmar, a lot of people do see their own federal identity as being their primary one. In the initial days, it was a carnival-like atmosphere with people, bodybuilders, women in princess dresses, up in Shan State along Inle Lake, people in their boats, the LGBT community in Yangon, coming together in what you can see were massive crowds, hundreds and thousands of people with music, fanfare. So the initial days, it was just this euphoric expression of public anger, but also public joy. It was almost like the people of Myanmar were reveling in their ability to protest and be seen protesting and bringing their creative energies in doing so. Of course, giving a voice to this protest and a kind of feel for it were young artists who were working in the digital sphere. So I start off by featuring one of my favorites, Kazin Suwai, who I also call Cuckoo, and she calls me Mummy actually, because she's someone I've worked with very, very closely. And she coined this term, "you messed with the wrong generation." And this captivated the public imagination. And she's very much, she symbolizes Gen Z in Myanmar. This is a generation that has grown up with access to the internet, with access to information, access to tools and techniques of creative expression and public protest, which is a very different kind from previous generations, so the generations of 1988 and 2000, where those protests were quelled by the military quite easily. But here you had a younger generation skilled in very different ways. So they were carrying out the warfare not only on the streets, but also on keyboards. So Cuckoo was one of the primary forces behind giving it a visual dynamic to the protesters. The three-finger salute from the Hunger Games series became very popular. And this was adopted by the young, again, a set of people who were maybe disaffected by politics, who were not as engaged, but suddenly in the face of losing their freedoms, were re-energized into expressing public opinion and coming out into the streets. So this gave birth to a massive online movement and outpouring of grief and anger through the use of the three-finger salute. And here, Gen Z, I must say, also brought several other techniques to fore in protesting. So they used VPN access. So some of the techniques that the military used to try and quell the protesters was to cut internet access. And of course, the young people found a way around it. So they started collaborating with their colleagues in Hong Kong and in Thailand and in other countries and getting access to VPN. And so they continued to use those sorts of techniques to make sure that their voices were heard and that they were reaching an international community. This is the time in which the hashtag "What's Happening in Myanmar" was really taking off, and with the three-finger salute kind of symbolizing it. In the cities, in the streets, in the provinces of Myanmar, meanwhile, people started expressing themselves by driving away the devil, which is a Myanmar practice where they take pots and pans and bang them. So the protesters decided to use 8 o'clock every evening as a symbolic moment to express public anger and make noise. So I was in Myanmar during that. I was there through February and early March. And every evening at 8 o'clock, you would hear a crescendo of pots and pans being banged. And then they added on the protest song from the 1980 generation protest music, which is incredible. I get goosebumps even now as I tell you this story, because you would hear the song kind of and the crescendo starting off in downtown Yangon, and slowly it would come to us. We were in Midtown, and slowly it would engulf the entire city. One of the key things I wanted to talk about here is also what happened through this protest movement. So like I said earlier, Aung San Suu Kyi was the only symbol, only person around whom people kind of rallied. She became the one and only symbol for democracy. But I think what happened through this public outpouring expression through February and March, and this bringing together of different voices, whether it was the students, the Gen Z, the garment sector workers, as well as other NLD politicians. So the committee representing Pidangsu Luto, which was the lower house of parliament, people who had been elected in the 2020 elections, had all been deposed and obviously, dispossessed by the military as soon as it did the coup. But they were all organizing on the sides. And what was quite interesting to notice in the public kind of expression of protest was her image was not the only one that people were using. It was almost as if the protest allowed people, gave them the freedom to express their identities, their ethnicities, their own political positions. So there was no more the pressure to just put Aung San Suu Kyi's figure forward as the only one. And this also liberated people in being able to express an apology to the Rohingyas. For the first time, you saw people saying, "I'm really sorry about what happened to the Rohingya." You had the ex-minister for social welfare, who's now part of the, the parallel, the government of deposed ministers, the National Unity Government. He's part of that Vimya A. who during his tenure as the Minister for Social Welfare under Aung San Suu Kyi's government was part of the group that was denying the genocide, who has actually issued a statement recently last week where he said, it is only after the coup when we were brutally oppressed ourselves that I myself can start to empathize with and begin to understand what the ethnic communities of Myanmar have gone through. So not just the Rohingya, but what the Shan, the Rakhine, the Karen, the Kachin have all been experiencing in the hands of the very brutal military junta. And of course, an echo of what happened after the Holocaust in Germany, that first they came for the Karen, we didn't speak out, then they came for the Rohingya, we didn't speak out, and now they're coming for all of us. So I think this is a really interesting development in terms of maybe the people of Myanmar coming to terms with their own very fractured history and complexities that maybe they haven't really been open to exploring before. So what did the military do in the face of this very unified protest? So first, I think they were taken by surprise. They really did not expect it, the ferocity of it, the unity of it, the innovativeness of it. So the military started engaging in a psychological warfare against the people. So at night, they started terrorizing people at night. They imposed martial law in several neighborhoods. They started individually targeting, protest leaders, people who were particularly active. They started targeting specific neighborhoods. So the young ended up actually protecting the neighborhoods in the daytime and then being in hiding at nighttime. And of course, this took a psychological toll because it was precisely meant to break down their resolve and their willpower. So here's an expression from another young woman artist, Vicky Nue, who has used what I think are brilliant, bold brush strokes to talk about what was happening to the people on the streets. It's young people protesting against tanks, young people protecting their neighborhoods, women kind of leading the way. And I think some of her art is really evocative. So by early March, the military started to escalate its attacks, and it took a definite violent turn. So on the 3rd of March, which is the day that I left Myanmar, so the first widespread attacks against protesters, the military opened gunfire. The light infantry division of the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, opened live rounds of fire against non-violent protesters in several cities. One of the first victims was this young girl, Angel Chalsin, who was wearing a t-shirt, "Everything will be okay." She was killed by a gunshot wound to her head. 38 other people were killed on the same day. And I think this brought an end to the kind of carnival-like atmosphere that persisted through most of February. This was a definite change in tone in terms of how the military was going to deal with protesters. It was a signal of things to come. The crackdowns continued. On the 14th of March, there was a big crackdown in the industrial zone where the garment factories and other factories are. Reports of many scores of people, over 40 people killed. On the 27th, the Armed Forces Day, March 27th, 114 people were killed, including very young people. This while the military generals hosted other military officials from several countries in South and Southeast Asia, including from India, and had a massive banquet. This is the day on which many people were killed on streets. By then, reports started emerging of brutality in custodial deaths, as well as brutality in detention. Artists, activists, actors, writers, journalists, comedians started getting picked up one by one. This data that I'm sharing with you is from the Association of Political Prisoners. This is very recent data from the 3rd of May. Where they show that nearly 5,000 people have been arrested, more than 700 people killed, and this number keeps rising. I think it's now over 800 as of yesterday. One other aspect I want to focus on briefly, and I'm just looking at the time, so we've got 5 minutes and I will conclude soon. One of the things I want to talk about is the role is how the women's movement has changed through the course of the protest movements. So the Myanmar military is a very male-dominated institution. And in Myanmar, men are are supposed to have pon, which is a spiritual power, a higher moral spiritual power, a kind of masculine aura almost. And that gets affected if they come in contact with a woman's, any garment that a woman wears on the lower part of her body. So particularly the longi, which is what Myanmar women tie around their waist. So around International Women's Day, the women of Myanmar did a tamen protest. Tamen is the sarong that women wear. And they strung tamen across streets. And of course, the military wouldn't cross these barriers because they were worried about losing their virility and masculine power. So it provided a real moment for the women's movement in Myanmar, which has always been on the fringes, has been trying to push a gender equal agenda for years now. And this protest has given the opportunity for the women's movement to put social and cultural norms right in the heart of public discourse. And so it was a massive opportunity. So you had men of all hues, colors, tying the women's sarongs on their heads. If there was ever a moment where gender norms were upended, this was one. I feature here another young woman artist, Emily Pyo, who has a series called 365, where it's a kind of census series where she features people of different ethnicities across Myanmar with a measuring tape drawn across their eyes. So she's carried that series into the COUP and has been using masks and hoods to kind of express her protest. And I think some of her pieces are extremely powerful. So Myanmar cities now look like war zones. They don't look like cities anymore. Downtown, these are pictures from downtown Yangon, a few meters from where I used to go to work. The tone has definitely changed. The young, now that the military has taken these extreme violent measures, the young are also not shying away from sharing violent imagery. So whether it's Molotov cocktails or guns or extreme violence, a lot of the imagery in the art is now beginning to definitely look darker and more violent. Journalists continue to be under attack, more than 50 now detained, and about 25 of them have been prosecuted. Citizen journalists have been playing a very crucial role in documenting what the military has been carrying out, both in the cover of dark as well as in daytime. So what's going to happen now? So what you see is now in urban centers, there is guerrilla warfare. The National Unity Government, which is basically the deposed ministers and other protest leaders who have all come together under a broad coalition, and with an acknowledgement that they are committed to federalism. So they have put together a ministry. So they are the kind of symbolic leadership of the protest movement and the call for a restoration of democracy. But an interesting development is several ethnic armed organizations have joined the National Unity Government, or at least expressed their support to what the National Unity Government wants to achieve. The Tatmadaw is aware of this, and of course the conflict has escalated in several conflict areas. So the Karen National Union, as well as the Kachin Independence Army, are engaged in fresh warfare in Kachin, Karen. Airstrikes have gone up. But at the same time, there are several other ethnic armed organizations that are still sitting on the fence and haven't clearly expressed an opinion one way or the other. People are fleeing to the border areas. People are on the run. There are also reports that the young are being trained along the border areas. The National Unity Government has said that they are putting together a federal army. The sanctions and boycotts imposed by several governments from the West are unlikely to have any impact because Myanmar, the main trade allies are China, Singapore, Thailand. The ASEAN bloc has shown very little resolve to take any step to halt the generals. The economy is in is in a very bad state, both because of COVID and now because of the coup. Some estimates are showing that within the next 6 to 8 months, you're going to have more than 50% of the population, about 24 million people, plunged into poverty, which is less than $1 a day. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of images. One is a little animation that again Cuckoo made, which I think is very deeply evocative, and then a final image. So I'm going to just start with this. For now, I leave you with an image from one of my favorite artists, Richie Tet, which features a mythological figure from Burmese mythology, Mi Bamapi, who is the protector slaying the demon in the garb of a military general. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm very happy to take questions that might come. Thank you for being a very patient audience.
Thank you so much, Vijaya. That was really quite remarkable. Yeah, really very moving for lots of reasons. There's a question that's come in. I'm helping out with the question side of things, and yeah, just to take the first one that's come in through Q&A, and please do use that, folks who are attending. So Katamina says, thank you so much for this. It's amazing to see how women and young people are leading the revolution in their country. The hashtag is all over the social media. What I particularly would like to know is, what are the Asian Tigers doing to end the conflict? So,
the answer is absolutely nothing. In fact, last week there was an ASEAN meeting and Aung Hlaing was invited. He went there in civilian clothes. He went in a suit, so he wasn't in his military uniform. There was an expectation from the Myanmar public that the Indonesian government or the Malaysian government were going to say something, but they said nothing. Thailand is unlikely to say anything because of its current trade agreements with the Myanmar government. The military, as you know, is in complete economic control. I mean, one of the reasons why they want to hold on to power is because they want to protect their economic interests, right? Their stranglehold over the Burmese economy and trade is complete.
yeah, and could you say something maybe about Bangladesh and India as well? I mean, it seems like the center of power moves more in the direction of Southeast Asia in terms of influence, I guess, from what you were saying.
Yeah, so the Indian government was one of the ones that sent an envoy for the Armed Forces Day celebration. So that tells you all you need to know about where the current Indian government stands in terms of its policy related to Burma. I think, Yeah, Bangladesh has been a little bit more vocal, but I think given their own geopolitical position and the fact that they're currently home to the more than 700,000 Rohingya refugees, they have also not been vocal as much as was expected, but they have been better than the others.
Yeah. And in terms of China, if you could say something about China, obviously there was relatively recent, meeting of sorts, I guess, and some suggestion of a bit of Chinese influence to at least curtail violence. I don't know if that was a mistaken impression, but that was kind of reported along those lines.
So the role of China in this has been very interesting. So there were several, how should I put it? I think there was some analysis saying that China knew this was coming, that the generals had consulted China before. And of course, China also blocks any security resolutions related to Burma. China and Russia have been quite clear in terms of where they stand. The Chinese influence in terms of the psychological warfare that the Burmese military is carrying out against its people by aiding them with technology is something that has also been alluded to, but not proven. The Chinese, of course, continue to deny that they have provided any technological help, but there is reasonable grounds to assume that they have provided the technology and the know-how for the army to carry out its psychological warfare, blocking internet access to several sections of the population, using very advanced tracking and tracing technology. So all of this, there is grounds to believe that the Chinese are aiding that. Politically broader in terms of how things will be dealt with in the Security Council or on regional platforms, it doesn't look like China is going to interfere in what they see or what they say is an internal affair of Myanmar, which is pretty much the same position that India has been taking, same position that Thailand has been taking. I think given the status of democracy in these countries, it won't be, I think I won't be stretching it too far by saying actually the people of Myanmar probably deserve democracy the most because they are the ones who have actually shown consistently their demand for it and a true understanding of what democracy means and stands for. So yeah, but I don't see them. Of course, the other thing I should probably talk about is that there's been an expectation from the Myanmar public of international, kind of the international actors stepping in and saving Burma. So there has been calls for the UN to intervene, expectations that a United Nations army will come in and save the people from the military. And of course, that's not likely to happen. And that is something that has upset people within Myanmar greatly because that expectation is very real. There have been hoardings saying how many deaths will it take for the UN to intervene.
Thank you. And that question about China was asked by one of our other attendees too. And Jackie Fox has said, where do you think the ASSK stands now with the public considering she's no, sorry.
Okay, so I should clarify. She's still very much a symbol. I think, if you go to a protest, you will still see posters that say, release Aung San Suu Kyi. So she's very much still a visual and symbolic figure. But I think what I was talking about more is that the protest has enabled a diverse set of other voices to also express themselves and seize the political space. So that has, even within the NLD, now they're not seeing her as the only leader, or they're seeing that maybe her leadership style, which is considered quite autocratic and not fit for purpose. So I think that's becoming more and more obvious to both people within her party, whether it is the committee representing Pidang Suluto, the CRPH, or the new National Unity Government, or the other forces that have come out, like Ithin Zamong and the Garment Union Workers. So I think you're seeing a more diverse political voice, but that doesn't mean that her importance is diluted in any way.
And do you think, presumably it's complicated, the international reaction to a certain extent, or degrees of sympathy for her particular position, and the ability of outside observers, put it that way, to parse the situation, to understand all the players. How does that complicate the position, particularly in relation to the Rohingya, I suppose, in particular?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Dan? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, just kind of wondering about how I suppose in particular Rohingya developments and the sort of discrediting of Aung San Suu Kyi, how has that affected the international response as you see it?
So it's been quite interesting, actually, not as much as I thought it would. I thought I'd see more of a, you saw this coming, or, you were not there with the Rohingya, so you deserve this. But that hasn't been the case. I think within the country, certainly the international engagement and the way the international community has felt about events is a deep sadness, because while it was, for those of us who worked within the country, it was always complicated. It was never black and white. So it wasn't a clear case of, oh, she didn't stand with the Rohingya. I mean, there were, one was aware that there were issues of not really taking other ethnicities into confidence, or not taking seriously enough the impact the conflict was having on the Karen, the Kachin, and the others. One was aware of that, but also one was aware of the barriers she was working against. So I think, and that it wasn't just that, she was also being played to an extent by the military. So I'm not defending her in any sense, but I'm saying for the international community, particularly that was working within the country to try and free up space for discourse, for discussion, this has been deeply saddening, because this is going to take Myanmar back by decades. So I don't think there was ever a sense of you had it coming. I think it was a sense of this moment is lost. But I'd like to take a positive look at this, because I think it has also presented a new moment. It might lead to more conflict and bloodshed, but I think in a way it's provided a greater clarity of purpose for the people of Myanmar.
Yeah, certainly the coalitions you're talking about do appear to be transformative, potentially at least. Nata, I think you had a question you wanted to ask, Nata.
You're muted.
I'm the one who has technological problems. Thank you for an excellent presentation. It was really inspiring. And I think, as Dan said, very moving about the level of people coming together and expressing their desires and hopes and resisting. So it's not just only desires and hopes, but actually resisting. So what I was interested in is to really understand a bit more about the young women who have come to the forefront. So what has motivated them? Because I think I read about one of them saying that they were never a feminist, as either they were feminist but not political, or they were political but not necessarily feminist. But there seems to be a fusion of these different identities coming together. So could you speak a bit more about what has influenced them, what has shaped them to come to the forefront like this?
Yeah. So that's a really, really good observation. And thank you for the question. So there's been the kind of traditional women's movement that has really tried to articulate its vision after the cyclone Nargis. So, that started to come together in 2010-11, when it was allowed to operate in the country. But that internal women's movement has been somewhere at odds with what the border groups, the ethnic armed organization related women's groups have been articulating for several decades, sort of on the borders outside the country. So there was never a clear moment of synergy or a clear common purpose between these different factions within the women's movement as such. And I think for young people particularly, maybe that didn't seem like an accessible space. It wasn't something that they could engage with very easily. But at the same time, with access to technology, information, and the world at large, I think women were finding a voice. So for example, Kuku herself, and I really wish she could have joined us today. I was hoping she would, but she's on the run at the moment. She would say that she doesn't necessarily, see herself as part of the women's movement. She calls herself feminist. So her feminism, or the way she articulates this, is very much based on her personal experience. And I think what you are finding is women who have organized, whether it is with students or the government workers, very much based on what they were experiencing in terms of suppression, oppression, and lack of rights, lack of freedoms, right? But they didn't necessarily see themselves as part of the women's movement, and the women's movement necessarily were not connected to these women either. And I think what's happened during this protest movement is a ceding of space actually by the main characters of the women's movement to these young activists because of the kind of energy and organizing ability and innovativeness that they have been able to bring. So the women's movement players have realized that they have only to gain by collaborating with these other women. And that's what has allowed those different forces to come together. So while they may not see themselves as part of the formal women's movement, I think the formal women's movement is now benefiting from their activism and voice.
We have a question that's come in from Cleona O'Keefe, and she says, thank you, Vijaya, this is a fascinating talk. I would be interested to know if you noticed increased militarization of Burmese society, for example, within the family, and what this might mean for gender relations, masculinities, gender-based violence against women.
Thanks, Cleona. Cleona and I did masters together several years ago in Sussex, and are also connected by Anatta. So lovely to talk to you, Cleo, here. Very interesting question again. I wouldn't say there's been an over-militarization or masculinization of Burmese men, but figures of violence against women are not available. There's no data. But the psychological impact of trauma that Burmese society has been through for so many decades, the psychological impact of active conflict in, there are 14 active conflicts in Burma today, and not counting the one in mainland Burma heartland. So all that comes with that terrain. Obviously, one of the primary impacts of that is felt by women. So figures of whether it's sexual violence in conflict or everyday forms of violence are high, but we don't have accurate data on what it really, really looks like. The impact of COVID has been devastating in terms of increase in domestic violence. And this is something that several NGOs have been documenting in it's primarily anecdotal evidence again. So I can't say that it's militarized societies, but, in terms of experience of violence, I think for a society that's gone through deep conflict for so many decades, it is what you would expect it to be.
Thank you. A couple of questions about, I guess, the almost, you might call it practical dimensions, but just the communications and how it operates. You talked about, well, possibly some Chinese assistance, but also the military being able to cut off communications, but obviously not entirely. So what kind of workarounds exist, and how do you maintain your own communications, for example, and how does the protest movement either galvanize people to turn out at a particular time at a particular place, or to send out the imagery, the very powerful imagery you were sharing?
Yeah, so they've literally done it through social networks. So in the initial days, it was Facebook. The Facebook is the internet in Myanmar. So I was not quoting some of my sources, but Burma does have more SIM cards than people. It's one of the most connected nations in the world. And so in the immediate days after the coup, it was Facebook that was primarily used to organize protests. Then, of course, the military caught on and they started to kind of realize. And that's when they started to impose internet shutdowns. And then, like I said, they used VPN, which was being bought for them by activists outside, because there are several still exiled Burmese activists who continue to live in, Europe, the UK, and other parts of the world. So they immediately activated their networks to buy VPN time. Thai SIM cards were used initially a lot because those were not traceable. Those couldn't be shut down because of the internet blockage. So they managed to override whatever the system was. Telecoms operators within Myanmar, like Telenor and Ooredoo, were also under instructions to shut down. And they, in fact, posted public messages saying, we're doing this under duress. We'll run afoul of the local laws if we don't listen to what these guys are asking us to do. But the young found ways, right? They managed to get around these. Instagram, and in fact, Twitter, which was not at all popular, I would say, before the coup, has now become extremely active. Everybody now is using Twitter. TikTok, not so much. In fact, the military used TikTok to promote images of violence against people on the streets, inciting violence. So the military used TikTok and kind of generated viral TikTok videos which were provoking people to violence. But the protesters have primarily used Facebook and Twitter.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, I mean, there's such a discourse about innovation, but I find this a fascinating example of innovation. highly inventive methodologies being pursued. I want to ask a different question about communications, which was a lot of your material that you were showing is English language, and the song, for example, with that very powerful video. What's the role of English? And I don't know about the linguistic diversity of Myanmar and whether that's a factor or not, or is it part of a strategy of international communication that's predicated on English?
So the education system was eroded during the Ne Win era. So it's quite common to find Burmese who were educated before 1960 would have very clipped British accents. And then as the system started getting eroded post 1960, and in fact, the education sector was what the generals went for, right? They wanted to stop all forms of critical thinking. The legal profession was completely decimated. So you had where lawyering was one of the most prestigious professions. By the time we were entering the country, the legal profession was drawing basically not very capable people because it was seen as a low profile sort of profession. So English language skills in the generations after 1960-70 are not very good. The Burmese struggle with English. Also, don't forget that during the dictatorship era, Burma was close to the world. So they had no access to what was happening in the rest of the world. So it's not uncommon to go and find Burmese covers of hit rock songs from the West, which the Burmese truly believe are their own because they never heard the originals. And so they would say, no, this was made in our country. You're just telling me some, hokey pokey story. When you'd say that, oh, no, look, this is the original song by XYZ, they wouldn't believe you. And there were several conversations like that I had with musicians. But I think the young definitely used English as a way to reach an international audience for the protest, because they realized that would give them some common ground. But a lot of the imagery I selected out because I didn't put it in here is actually in Burmese. Even not accessible to people like me. So there's a huge outpouring of art and, expression in Burmese language as well, which I haven't actually included here.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's very helpful to clarify that. Actually, I wanted to ask you about that point about being present there as an international person, as an outsider in that sense. And you talked at the beginning about questions of trust and that they're magnified because of the experience in the country. But if you could say something a little bit more about that, would really be fascinating to know how that worked in your experience.
Yeah, so it's because again, during the dictatorship, the practice was very much to have informers in the community, right? That relayed information to the generals, to the specific departments tasked with, keeping an eye on the population. So old habits die hard. So the people, my colleagues in my office, never stopped looking over their shoulder, or never stopped watching their words before expressing them, So, and the international community, so it is just inbuilt behavior, right? It's not just about their relationship with people like me, who's an outsider, but also the inability to trust on somebody within their own country unless they knew them inside out. So they wouldn't really share their true opinions or true political leanings. Still, they were absolutely certain about who they were talking to. So for people like me, it meant earning their trust. And it took me years to break that barrier with several colleagues till they would actually open up and say what they truly, truly thought. And I think after the reaction of the global community to the Rohingya genocide, which several Burmese people really felt hurt about because they genuinely believed the fake narrative that the military was giving them, I mean, it wasn't just happenstance that people were believing that there was a genuine threat from the Rohingya to their communities. That was a line that the military was selling because they had to create that scepter of the enemy, right? The other. And so the military, with its nationalist Buddhist monks that are very closely allied to them, were definitely selling that narrative of, the other that was going to pose a threat to the Bamar Buddhist identity. So when the international community reacted the way it did post the genocide, it was genuinely a surprise to a lot of Burmese people, including those working in the sectors that I worked in, who had bought that narrative of a serious threat to Burma's internal peace and unity from the Rohingya. And I think the falling of the scales thereafter and what that public apology that you're now seeing now, not widespread, it's still marginal. That's why it becomes more significant because, you have to start somewhere.
Nata, I wonder if I could hand back to you because we've come to the end of our hour, but maybe Nata, if you could, back to you, so to speak. I just say for my own part, thank you so much. Really fantastic to hear your thoughts and to learn so much more intimately about this. So yeah, Nata.
Yes. Thank you so much, Vijaya. It was very, very fascinating. And it also, I think, I'm sure many of the people in the audience would like to have other opportunities to interact with you. And I particularly would like to learn much more about the women's movement because I think we're at a cutting edge right now where the women's movement has the potential. There's so many gender issues that have come to the fore in the context of COVID. And how do we build now forward? And Myanmar seems to be a fantastic example of the potential of the young and the old coming together for a new society. So thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you to the audience as well for joining us.
Sure. So, and we'll be sharing the recording on our YouTube channel. So again, thank you to everybody for attending. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed putting that together as well.
Yeah, thanks to David Kelly too for hosting us as ever behind the scenes. So take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.